So we're here at Fluent, and a lot of the conversation has been around Angular, around React, around frameworks. But a common hallway conversation is the how do I choose which one? How do I know that I know enough to choose? Do I need any of this stuff? You've obviously been working in this space for a while. JavaScript is what you do, but where should people start?
Yeah, so first of all, to set the record straight, a lot of people tend to label me an anti-framework sort of a person because I spend so much time trying to amplify the focus on JavaScript itself. And therefore, if I'm not talking about React, it must be a bad thing. So I don't think React is bad. I don't think Angular is bad. I don't think any of these tools are bad. What is dangerous about them is that they are so good at abstracting and pulling you away from that quote-unquote bare metal, the JavaScript itself, that you are almost encouraged not to dive in and understand what's happening. And the problem with that is that it works when you're on the happy path. When everything's working great and you just happen to be on your game that day and everything you code works well, you don't actually need to understand. As a matter of fact, it's much more effective and your boss will be much happier because you'll ship features much faster when you just kind of plug things together and it just works. But most of us spend most of our time not on the happy path. Most of us spend our time trying to figure out it should work and it's not working and I don't know why it's not working. And I have a theory. It's not something I can prove, but I have a theory that if you don't know why a piece of code works, you have no hope of understanding why it broke.
That would be my experience with Linux, certainly,
yeah,
yes.
I think you fundamentally have to understand it. So to pull it into a metaphor for just a minute, to pull out of code and pull it into a metaphor, you can drive a car without understanding any of the mechanics of how an engine works. And as long as your car is working great, that works well. As soon as you have a problem where something starts to break and the light is blinking at you and you have a problem, if you have no understanding of the mechanics of the car, you are now at the mercy of someone else. They decide what to tell you, and you have no way of knowing whether or not what they're telling you is correct. You have no way of participating in the process of getting to a solution. So my advice to developers is to whatever level of abstraction you find that you need to work at that makes you effective, and I encourage that, but whatever level that is, to master that level for whatever term, for whatever definition we mean for the word master, because I don't actually believe that you arrive at mastery, you approach it.
You approach it, I like that. It's a destination, but you're not going to get there.
It's asymptotic.
It's a goal. Yes.
You never get there, it's asymptotic. But so for whatever definition of mastery, that you should be approaching that mastery level, you should be thinking deeply about understanding all the parts of that. But you should also have a strong competency in the layer below that. You should understand what that stuff is doing or what that stuff is targeting or what that stuff is building to, because when stuff breaks, that's where the answer is. Inevitably, the answer will not be in the layer that you're working in, but understanding that layer better.
It's actually gotten even wilder than that, because the layers are kind of piling up on each other, or you'll have multiple things adjacent, or you'll load something and you'll discover that it's running Angular, React, and jQuery all at the same time. It almost feels like an aesthetic problem, like how do you choose which pieces to connect? The people coming up to this set of issues often come to it from one place. There are people who just learn JavaScript through jQuery, and it actually works pretty well as long as you're not trying to create complex logic. The steps down from that can seem really daunting. So how do people get started? How do they get this foundation that they need to break out of what seems like the easier path with a few cliffs off the side?
Yeah. So first off, I'll say it's not binary. There's not one path to being effective as a developer. It's not that you have to start with JavaScript and then learn abstraction, or you have to start with abstraction and then at some point learn. As a matter of fact, it's very cyclical. I think sometimes you spend your time thinking more about the nuts and bolts of how something is working. And sometimes you think about the layers of abstraction. I read recently a very clarifying point about this whole notion of what abstraction even is. That abstraction is not about hiding things. Abstraction is about making sure that you focus on the stuff you're supposed to focus on, removing the distraction so that you are more effective at the things that you're working on. That will naturally be cyclical. There'll be things that you focus on for this point in time, for this period of time, and then at a different time there's other focus. So I believe that you need to be able to go back and forth between those, at times working at these higher levels, at times digging in and understanding more about what's going on. I would encourage and challenge developers that there should be no part of the application that you treat as a black box that is ununderstandable.
The carburetor.
Yes, exactly. We should be able to dive into the thing and understand how it works, even though we're not going to play at that level all of the time, because we're going to be more effective at this level. You should not be able to walk away and say, I have no idea how that thing works. It's a house of cards, don't touch it, it works because it works. The other thing I would say, and I'm going to push this a little bit in a maybe slightly more controversial direction, is that I think one of the problems that we have is that we begin to rely too heavily upon these abstracted tool layers. And I think sometimes we forget that the original intent of a framework was not to always be present for the entire life cycle of an application. The original notions of frameworks were sometimes more about helping you rapidly iterate and prototype. And they were designed to be retreating from the application as the application matured. We now have frameworks which are designed to be there for the entire time. And I would argue that a framework which has to stay in place and cannot be, factored out little by little is less of a framework and more of a platform. And that's okay if you're making those choices, but I think frameworks are more effective when they help us rapidly iterate on a problem space that we don't understand. And then as we mature an application, we as developers have a responsibility to make sure that we are pulling back those pieces and leaving only what's necessary. I think the best code is the code that is exactly the solution, no more and no less. We don't need to leave those bits in there just because theoretically someday somebody might want it, because what we've actually done is create a larger surface area to learn for the next wave of developers that come to the code base. And what happens is those developers come to the code base and can't figure it out, and so they rewrite it with the new hot framework of the day.
And you just keep growing and growing and growing.
Exactly.
Well, the framework communities frequently exist. I mean, people help each other with the frameworks, but you also get a certain amount of cheerleading around that. I love the community part, but I sort of wonder, are there ways that people can help each other out of this pile and help each other find those lower layers of abstraction? There are actually there's a JS cheerleader account, which is pretty awesome. But where do you go to find that?
I think we can just all start to tell our stories more. I think we can start to say, you know what, I got by making a project and I didn't need 14 different frameworks to do it. Or I started out with a framework and it was helpful, and then I removed this piece and left just the, as you said at the beginning, just the vanilla JavaScript. I think those are the sorts of stories that if more people would try that and more people would tell that story, other developers would realize that there's value in knowing and understanding and using just the code that's necessary, rather than always feeling like everything has to have all those layers of abstraction.
Something I've been surprised by, happy about, I have mixed feelings about ES6 itself and all of its parts, but that leap, that change, has made a lot of people talk about JavaScript itself very specifically again. Has that helped, or is that also getting wrapped into the framework stories? Or, well, both, I guess. But how does that dynamic work?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I do spend an awful lot of time in my trainings helping people understand what narrative and what context you should approach ES6 in. It is not simply a whole bunch of new shiny features that TC39 has thrown at us and said, okay, go play with them, right? There is a reason why, or at least I think there's an opinionated way to guide people through this, which is the approach I try to take. And so the most important narrative I think about ES6 is not new stuff, but new ways of doing old stuff. And developers are typically fairly aware of this notion of the difference between imperative coding and declarative coding. And this is, again, not a binary. It's not that code should be all imperative or even all declarative, as if that would be even possible, right? And different generations of developers have moved the needle between those two extremes in different ways. But somewhere in between there is the code that is most understandable, is most readable, is most relearnable by a new set of eyes that don't know all the same stuff that, as I say, they don't have all the cult wisdom that you did when you wrote the code. There's somewhere in between that. And what gets me excited about ES6 is that it adds more declarative structures to the syntax of the language. My favorite one is destructuring, because destructuring takes things that we've all done, taking an array or an object, especially nested objects and arrays, to go and find those values and pull them out and use them is a very imperative thing that requires a very brittle set of A.B.C.D sort of traversal of those structures. And that code doesn't tell a developer really what you're doing or why you're doing it. It just gets the job done. It's extremely imperative. Whereas destructuring says we are going to be very declarative about the thing and let JavaScript actually take care of the how. So declarative means saying what I want to accomplish, and imperative means how I want to accomplish it. So playing with those balances allows us to get more into code that is understandable, that is more reasonable, that is more maintainable. So that's the perspective I take on ES6, and I try to show the before and after. Do you see why this code will make more sense, not just to the developer who wrote it just then, but to a developer later? Maybe there's less chance that they're going to have to rewrite it the next time.
Rewriting less sounds great, and declarative always makes me happy. So hopefully this will help people find their way to valuing JavaScript, using it, celebrating it, and passing it on to somebody without the screaming madness. Great.
I hope so too.
Thank you.